Thank you for tuning in to the Practical Preservation Podcast. Please take a moment to visit our website, practicalpreservationservices.com, for additional information and tips to help you restore your historical home. If you've not done so, please subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, or SoundCloud, and also like us on Facebook. Welcome to the Practical Preservation Podcast, hosted by Danielle and Jonathan Kepperling. Kepperling Preservation Services is a family-owned business based in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, dedicated to the preservation of our built architectural history for today's use as well as future generations. Our weekly podcast provides you with expert advice specific to the unique needs of renovating a historic home, educating by sharing our From the Trenches preservation knowledge and our guests' expertise, balancing modern needs while maintaining the historical significance, character, and beauty of your period home.
Today on the Practical Preservation Podcast, we have Michael Emery with us, and we are actually at the Cornwall Furnace historic site owned by the state, and I'm really enjoying all the buildings and everything. So thank you for inviting me out and agreeing to be on the podcast today.
Well, thank you.
So tell me a little bit about your background.
I'm a native Pennsylvanian. I was born in Honeybrook Township, Chester County, so that's where Chester, Lancaster, and Berks County all come together. And it was an area that was great to grow up in. I come from very large extended families that had lived in that area for literally hundreds of years. And that was a place that I really treasure growing up in, and that's really where my first exposure to historic architecture and things were, because I had, again, this large extended family, grandparents, great-grandparents living in the area, and both my living great-grandparents owned historic farms, lived in 18th century buildings, one log, one stone. And in one case, the family had owned the property since the 1840s, and my great-grandmother that lived on that property was born in the 19th century. She was born in 1890, and in many ways, that property, they were still cooking on a wood cook stove, so it was a very kind of old way of doing it. So I kind of got interested in historic preservation and things quite by accident. It was just because it was the environment that I was around, and really didn't know any better, but it certainly enjoyed it. So I then went to school, went to Penn State. My sister was also a Penn State graduate. I was accepted there as a nuclear engineering student, and probably one of the best and most influential conversations was with my sister. She was a food science major, works for a chocolate company here in Pennsylvania. And one day I'd been accepted, it was the summer before I was to go, and she said, do you really want to do math and science every day for the rest of your life? And it was odd because of my age. There were essentially, if you were a kind of a college-bound male in kind of the Reagan era, you were going to be a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer, and I didn't want to be the first two, so that kind of left the ladder. So when I came to the census, I said, no, that's not really what I'd want to do. And the other thing is that I was an ROTC student at Penn State, and that was also at the time of the end of the Gulf War, so there was a great kind of a downsizing of the military. Oh, yeah. So being an officer really wasn't going to be an option for me anymore. So I had been taking classes. I was a history major because that was really what I liked. So I had changed that even before I got to Penn State. And I then ended up looking for, remember this is the days when you had a big paper catalog that you went through. And I remember I was trying to get an art credit. Okay. And I came across these classes that were in American Studies, and there was one that was on decorative arts, and there was one that was on architecture, kind of a introduction to historic preservation class. So I ended up taking that. The professor's name was Dick Pensick, who also had an interesting background. He was a professor of kinesiology, so he did a lot of teaching of racquetball classes. He had been Penn State's lacrosse coach at one time. But he was really the first person to kind of open my eyes into this whole idea of decorative arts as a study. I had been going to auctions since I was a kid. I'd been collecting since I was a kid, so I had the interest, but I just didn't have anything with any academic rigor to kind of start that. So I took that class, I took an architecture class, and then eventually, since I was kind of casting about, didn't know what I was going to do, an internship came due, and he kind of threw it on my desk one day and said, "Hey, Mike, I think you'd be good at this. Why don't you apply?" And the internship was for the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. So I became an intern at the Daniel Boone Homestead, which is one of our properties in eastern Berks County, Daniel Boone's birthplace. And there I met a man by the name of Jim Loers, who was the site administrator. And Jim was just an absolutely the person I needed to meet at that time period, because he was someone who knew history very well. He was also someone who got you excited about it, but he also knew historic architecture very well. So he was the one who started driving me around and showing me the area, which is known as the Ole Valley, which has these wonderful architectural gems, great preserved land. And I started to get an eye, and it was funny, after that first summer, as I drove through areas that I had known my entire lifetime, now I knew the vocabulary that went with the buildings, and now I knew, most likely the house type and plan was this, and you could tell that from the outside. So, Jim did a really good, and then as it turned out, later on, after graduation, I was hired, worked there at Daniel Boone Homestead for 2.5 years. He was my boss. He also ran another site, Conrad Weiser Homestead in western Berks County. He was my boss there as well. And then eventually I worked at Landis Valley Museum. I was there for 13 years, and through some reorganization around 2009, he became the site administrator there. So he followed me. I went there in 2005. So that's what really kind of got me into museums, and it was not something that when I was a 15-year-old, I was thinking I'm going to be a museum guy. At that time period, I thought that I might be driving a nuclear-powered submarine. So I did this, kind of complete 180, going from sciences to the humanities. But it was something that I certainly don't regret.
I have a really good friend who was. She graduated with her degree in nuclear engineering and is now works as an acupuncturist. So
certainly it's not a growth industry.
Yes. So you kind of talked about why history and preservation. So tell me a little bit about the site that we're at now, the Cornwall Iron Furnace.
Well, Cornwall is located in Cornwall, Lebanon County, so we're really just over the line from Lancaster County. Route 322 historically ran right through the site, and did because of the furnace location. As a historic site, this has been operating since 1932. One of the owners, whose name was Robert Coleman, his great-granddaughter, gave it to the Commonwealth in 1932. We're a rather small site for a historic site. We're 5 acres, though we hold some of the most historically significant and important buildings, I think, that the Commonwealth owns.
And I did think, I was doing research prepping for this, and I thought it was really interesting that they were talking about this is the last intact
cold blast iron furnace.
Iron Furnace that in the Western Hemisphere, is
that
correct? Okay.
Yes, and that's the thing, is that so many other iron furnaces, number one, we're oftentimes, the furnace stack is what most people consider the furnace. But of course, around the stone stack, there would have been a place for the blast apparatus, a place to do casting, and also a way to charge the furnace.
Right.
Most of the time, those were built out of wood. And most of the time, when the furnace stopped operation, that also stopped the family's income.
Right.
So usually the building at that time was abandoned, usually looted for anything that would be necessary. In this case, the Coleman family, which ended up in ownership of Cornwall Furnace, retained a fair amount of income. This was one of their furnaces.
Right.
And also the iron deposit that they ended up having, a very large stake in ownership, was the largest one east of the Mississippi. And for a number of years was the largest period in the United States,
Right.
and ran up until closure in 1973. So it ran from the 1730s all the way up until 1973. And approximately 106 million tons of iron ore were extracted out of the mine, and done, with modern methods when Bethlehem Steel owned it.
So when did the furnace start in production here?
The furnace was started by a man by the name of Peter Grubb, and Peter comes from southeastern Pennsylvania. He's descended from 17th century folks that had come through Delaware, then through Chester County, and by all accounts, he was a mason. So he's someone who knew about stone. So the thought is that a possibility that he was coming to these hills here because of the stone, not necessarily because of the ore, but quickly found that there were these rich iron ore deposits that were just on the surface, gets title to the land, and then starts to experiment with it. So initially in the 1730s, he begins mining. He builds a bloomery forge, which is a very early way of making iron directly from the ore, where they actually heat up the iron in kind of like a large blacksmith's forge, and then put it under a water-powered trip hammer. And by the action of literally slamming that piece and smashing it, you drive slag out of the material, and then you're left with iron, which has issues with it. It's inefficient. You get things that are buried within the iron that are impurities. So after, I think, just a few years, it was worth then building a larger operation. So then Grubb in 1742 somehow scrapes together the money to go ahead and build an operating furnace. So water power coming down to run the blast apparatus, a stack, a casting room, and of course everything else that's needed off of that. He also builds a forge to refine the pig metal that's made here, so the cast into market bars that could then be used by blacksmiths. So taking cast iron, making it over into wrought iron. 1744, though, so just 2 years later, he advertises in the Pennsylvania Gazette to try to put this out to let or to rent. So the response is then is made by a group of investors out of Baltimore, Maryland, who form what they call the Cornwall Company. So they enter into agreement in 1745 and then run that until 1765.
Okay, and is the 1765 then when the Colemans take over?
Well, no, what happens is that Peter Grubb dies in 1754. He has two sons, Peter and Curtis. So they take over operation in 1765, and over time, you have tension between the two brothers. Ultimately, one of them dies in there, and Robert Coleman then starts to gain control of the furnace in the late 1780s, and then by the 1790s has full control of the furnace.
And the Colemans were the ones that made the huge Gothic buildings, is that correct?
Yes, the descendants of Robert Coleman. So Robert Coleman, locally, he lived in Lancaster in the latter part of his days, has a lot of history in Lancaster itself. His descendants still own what is now Elizabeth Furnace, north of Brickerville.
Oh, yes.
That was one of Robert's holdings. He actually owned that before he owned Cornwall. He also built locally, west of Mount Gretna is a little village of Colebrook. That was a furnace that was also built by Robert Coleman in 1791. And they owned all of the land between those areas.
Oh.
So this had been about 10,000 acres, and then later on the Colemans owned about 20,000 acres here, including agricultural holdings. Most of that, of course, was necessary for wood that would eventually be, we're sitting right now in a charcoal barn.
Right.
Yeah, so this was storage for this building. And it took approximately an acre a day for every one of those furnaces to operate. So that took huge amounts, teams of people that were out cutting down trees, processing it, making it into charcoal, and then bringing them to store in the charcoal barn. So they just needed vast amount of timberland
Right.
to be able to do that.
And then, what was I thinking about? We talked a little bit before we started recording about, because as I was driving, I remembered that the Colemans held slaves. So have you been researching that, or are you telling that story as part of the tour?
We are telling that story as part of the tour. We also have it in our orientation exhibit, but it's something like a lot of history that hasn't been told before isn't always the easiest to find.
Right.
And we had a person who was an intern back in the 1990s do a paper on it, who currently works for the Museum Commission. Brett Ray is one of our archivists. And that was really the jumping off point of some of our history. And he was looking at that history from really in the 1760s to the 1790s. But we also know that from records that from the Cornwall Company, the one that held it in the 1740s, 50s, and into the mid-60s, that these Maryland folks that were the investors also had slaves and brought them here. And their records are around. That was the one thing that a lot of people were looking for, the records of the earliest part of Cornwall.
Okay.
They're not in Pennsylvania.
Oh, they're in Maryland.
They're in Maryland, and primarily because there had been a dispute between two of the owners later on. They were entered into evidence. So therefore,
so that's perfect,
in the
yeah.
Maryland State Archives
Yeah.
are the early ledger books of the furnace. So they've been examined by a couple of scholars. It's not something I've been able to get at yet, but would love the opportunity to see them. Our other ledgers for the 18th century and into the 19th century, many of those are in the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. Brett looked through many of those and was looking at payments and also oftentimes debits from some of the slaves, what they were buying at the company's store. And we know that there are lists also that show up for different tax purposes and for things. So we're getting in and looking at that history a lot more, because it's something that very few people think about when they think of Pennsylvania.
Right.
They don't think of, and of course when you look at slave holdings in the north, particularly in Pennsylvania, iron furnaces and forges tended to hold the most slaves.
That is true.
And a lot of them tended to be people that had skill, that they were not just a laborer, they were doing other sorts of things. And locally, the one person that if people know the name of one of the slaves that worked for the family, it is Governor Dick. Governor Dick's Park, Governor Dick's Hill. We know the most about Governor Dick because in, I believe it was 1798, the manager of Cornwall Furnace puts an ad in one of the local newspapers, a man by the name of Rudolph Kelker, and he describes Governor Dick, describes him, and the one thing I find very interesting about it is that it talks about the scarring around his eyes. So this was, scarring that had happened most likely in Africa. So he's not an American born, he's most likely African born, comes here, and also calls him a carpenter. And that one of the things that he has is a foot injury. He had, I guess at some time during his time of working in wood, had buried an axe into his foot. So that's something that makes it into the description. So again, we're attempting to tell that story and would like to tell a richer story there than the information we have. But it's something that as I'm getting time, I'm looking into, and certainly it's one of those research things as we get grad students and people looking to do internships. it's very high on my list to have that as one of the things that we discuss and look at.
Yeah, I think that there's a trend, right, and it's been a trend probably the past 20 years. It's not just right
recent,
now.
right?
Yeah, but to tell the more complete story, and I think that helps everybody understand, the complexity and everybody was working together to build, willingly or not.
Right.
Yeah, but everybody was involved in
But the idea
this,
of who built America,
Yes.
not the person who was in charge of it, but who was actually, with the sweat in their hands.
Yeah.
And, here at Cornwall, like a lot of places, we had enslaved Africans. We had indentured people that were Irish and German. And we also had Hessians during the American Revolution that were being leased out by, kind of the new, revolutionary government to go ahead and to work here as well.
Were they making munitions then, or?
That was one of the things that during the American Revolution, both Peter and Curtis Grubb were actually colonels in the Pennsylvania branch of the American Army. And they also took on munition contracts. So they took on contract to make 42 naval guns. So they were making cannon, and they were also then making cannonballs for them. And when you look at the Hessians that were here, and I'm just using that as a general term, many of them were artillerists. And one of the things that the government contract called for is that when you made a gun, you had to essentially load it heavy and fire 2 good rounds out of it
To make sure it was.
to make sure that it didn't explode, because that's not good for morale when your guns explode. So we think that the very good possibility is that they were using these Hessians to go ahead and to fire the guns. So since they already had the skill set. And we know from archaeology and from just local lore, for many, many years in a meadow over on Cornwall Manor's property, they found cannonballs, and they're the 12-pounders that would come out of the naval guns that were being cast here. So we think that those were the ones that were being test fired and were just, unrecovered out of that field.
Yeah, that's very interesting. But yeah, you hear about finding unexploded, I don't know if that's the word, rounds places. So that makes sense that if they were testing stuff out, they weren't going to find it all.
No, they weren't finding it all. So
okay, well, tell me a little bit about the challenges that you have preserving Pennsylvania Historic Museum Commission site.
Well, of course, the one thing that we're very happy about is that this is a state-funded operation. So the taxpayers of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, this is part of one of the things that they're paying their hardworking money toward, is to keep places like this up and operational, and we're grateful for that. But of course, over time, some of that support has eroded at times, and a lot of our places, we don't have many people on our staff anymore. But, we talk about kind of the Hazelon days of the bicentennial, where there were pots of money that were coming out of the federal government, more pots of money that were being directed out of state government, and a lot of large projects were being done at that time. So, that's not something that we've been the beneficiary of. It's hard to believe, but, now that's going on almost 50 years. So a lot has happened in that time period. But we've also, I think, gotten a little bit smarter in the way that we've done it. The money is going to areas where we do see more long-term preservation of the buildings, because we're looking at, okay, if we do put this roof on this building, we want to do it once and not do it twice, because it's going to cost you more in the long run to do it that way. So, we're trying to economize as much as possible. But for this site, one of our biggest challenges is just the scale of the buildings. It's an industrial site. I remember I live in a historic home. I grew up in a historic home as well. And when I was looking at things, my father, who's a very, very practical, Pennsylvania Dutchman, would look at us and say, if you have a big building, everything costs more. You have larger roof, you have larger this, you have larger, everything is going to cost more. And we're kind of looking at that here. I mean, our square footages are enormous.
Oh, yeah.
And we have stone buildings, thank goodness, but even stone buildings need to be repointed.
Yeah.
We have slate roofs, but if the slate goes, there's something wrong,
Yeah.
it's
That's really
very expensive.
Yeah.
So, we have those sorts of things. We also, the last time that there was an economic downturn, the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission lost approximately a third of its staff. And those levels have never come back.
up, yeah.
So, we're doing more with less.
Yeah.
But, of course, the community has been very helpful in that as well. All of our sites have what they call friends or associate groups. So
Okay.
at this site, we have a group which is the Cornwall Iron Furnace Associates, which does business as the Friends of the Cornwall Iron Furnace. So it's a nonprofit support group. It's a 501c3. So they're very active in helping us to get and recruit volunteers. They help us out financially. They actually provide 2 staff members for me. I have 2
that's
part-time staff people that are here. So, between this kind of public and private partnership, we're able to keep things going. Now, of course, this is all kind of pre-COVID.
Right.
So, this is a story that's still being written,
Right.
so we have to kind of see what's going on. And I know that there is a great deal of fear. I've seen within museum circles places that are already closing that say they will not reopen,
Yeah, I've seen
that this is
too.
it.
Yeah.
And some people are saying that there could be possibly a third of museums that will then go out of existence after this is all finished. So this is, like every other aspect of the economy in America,
Right.
this has just been something that has, devastated kind of every aspect of American
Yes.
society.
Yeah, that's that. I heard that, and I actually heard them talking about that again this morning while I was getting ready on the TV show that was on, and I could see, because especially if you count on, I think in some ways you're fortunate to be a state-owned site.
Absolutely.
Because like if you're counting on admissions to fund your museum, and people can't come, or you
Right.
have to really reduce your sizes, that I could see how that would be a huge impact.
Yes. So right now we're fine as far as that's concerned, but eventually even our agency, admissions money goes into a fund which then helps to fund positions and
Right.
also helps to pay other bills.
Right.
So even as a state agency being closed,
Right. It's not.
we'll have an economic impact.
Right. Yeah, definitely. So I noticed when I was on the website that you have several educational resources and a virtual tour. Are you doing more things like that because of the COVID?
We are. One of the things that the organization here did for a number of years was have speakers.
Okay.
So we would have a lecture series, and we did that in partnership with our neighbor Cornwall Manor Retirement Community. And we would have talks in what was the 19th century cattle barn on their property.
Yes.
You'd never know it today. It's really been redone, but it was actually in one of the 19th century Coleman spaces. And it afforded us a nice large location, wonderful AV and everything.
Yes.
And plus we had a number of people from Cornwall Manor who would come to the talks. And we would get anywhere between 50 to maybe 75. We had maybe 100 for one of our larger talks. And we had to cancel our first couple. The way that COVID hit this site is that typically the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission has an opening day in March, which is Charter
the
Day.
Charter Day, yes.
So we had that the second Sunday in March, as we normally do. We had our lecture here at Cornwall that Tuesday, had a very nice crowd, and then we closed the following Sunday.
Right.
So we were really open for the season. Now we're open during the winter, but
Right.
I mean, we always see that at least
It's
mentally
like
as the
you started,
kickoff
yes,
of the season. So we were open for a little bit less than a week. So of course everyone thought this will be a couple of weeks and we're done.
Yeah.
And then it's going to be a couple of months and we're done. So after it went for a little while, we started looking and think, well, we have to go ahead and have more of a presence. We did a lot of things on Facebook, but it's like, well, we have to regularize this and get it out to a larger audience. So one of my volunteers actually approached me. He said, you know what, I would you want to try, to do an online talk? And I had already been thinking in that direction.
Right.
So when he voiced it, I was already there. I was already on the page. And we had some of our board members also that were interested, so we went and got a pay Zoom account to do the webinar version of it, because that's also in the early days of Zoom when everyone was talking about the issues they were having with security, and it's like, well, we don't want to do that. And, so we were able to do, and we've had now 2 lectures in our series, both of which had about 100 people actually sign up, but of course, some people are watching with their spouse, their family, their other. So, we think that we've had probably about 150 people. And when we looked at the names of the folks, because that's another thing, you could see kind of who's there. Some were people that we knew. Some were people that were board members. But there were lots of names we'd never seen those people before.
Great.
So we are
reaching
a larger audience. And, that is the one nice thing, is that oftentimes events are very geographically limiting.
They are.
You have to be in the area in order to attend. Well, that's no longer a barrier.
Right.
So that's helpful in that respect. So we're looking at trying to do more of that. I know PHMC in general is looking into a larger IMLS grant for technology to be able to do more, live streaming of different types of talks, tours, videos, all those sorts of things to be able to reach out, because we're not only looking at our day-to-day visitor, but we're also looking at what are schools and what are students going to require in this new age as well. So we're looking into all those sorts of things and hoping to be able to provide content at different levels and for different reasons and usage.
And that makes a lot of sense to me. Once, thankfully, our projects were not impacted because that we got an exemption for the shutdown. But anyway, in like early April, I'm like, we need to do something, because we usually go out and do speeches and things. So I'm like, so we started doing a preservation coffee break. So every Wednesday at 4:30, we've been coming on, and if nobody comes on, we'll just talk about whatever we want to talk about. Like, and it's not very planned. But and it's 10-15 minutes of just us talking. But if somebody comes on and they have like specific questions, we'll chat with them and talk to them. So I've been calling it like office hours for preservation.
Very good, very good.
But it's kind of fun, and it's fulfilling my dream of being like a advice columnist. So
get to kick the tires on that.
Yes. I'm not guaranteeing that I'll give you good advice, but I'll give you advice.
Very good.
So, what challenges or trends do you see in preservation beyond?
Kind of in general?
Yeah, just in general.
There are certain things that trouble me, and I think that because I'm the heart a real stuff guy. I like buildings. I like things. And again, going back to kind of my youth, I remember I was very close to my grandparents. And my paternal grandfather was born in 1914. His father was born in 1877. So as we would drive around the area that I grew up, he would talk about landscapes from his youth. So I'm looking at the 1920s and all these things that were now gone.
Yes.
And I thought that in my lifetime, I would never see that number of buildings change and be destroyed. Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that I really mourn for this area, is that we almost at times treat historic resources as something that will grow back. Yeah. And it's not a crop of corn. Yeah. You'll never get it back. No. And I know there are TV shows that are out there right now where they're harvesting buildings.
Right. Yeah.
And that's something where if the building is going to end up in the lands in a landfill, that's one thing. But I think as soon as historic fabric is kind of made a commodity in that way, then people have the impotence to sell them as a commodity. And that's something that is just troublesome, because I see, going, on my drive here this morning, I saw a new log building that was uncovered. And I sit there and think, is that a building that's going to get restored, or is that going to end up as 100 mantles over people's or flooring? And again, that's something that I just it's a surprise. It's an alarming trend, and something particularly in an area like this, where people oftentimes think we have so much, but we've also lost so much.
I agree with you. And I, as part of my consulting work, I go out and do demolition reviews for one of the rural counties in Lancaster, and almost all of them are plain families that want to tear down their house. And most of the time, I don't have an issue saying this is okay, because they've already taken everything historic off of it, and the building's just old. But I've been thinking, like, I think it's a mindset, and I don't think that I could actually convince them that newer isn't better, even though but I've been thinking about that a lot too. So that's interesting that you said that, because I do think that it's understanding why it's important, not just that it's old.
Right.
And after you've taken everything historic off of it, then it is just an old building.
Right, and it's gone. Well, and I can tell you, in the beginning of the interview, I was telling you my background about my great-grandparents' farms. Yeah. Neither of those houses stand. Yeah. Neither of them. One, a log structure, probably late 18th century, and the other a stone structure from the late 18th century, and both in that time period are now gone. Yeah. And again, that's just my memory of just two buildings. Yeah. But as you take that across the landscape, it makes a definite effect, and it's something that certainly I think will cheapen the experience of those people that will come after us.
I agree.
Looking at down the road, why did we preserve a place like Cornwall? We preserved it so that future generations will be able to learn about where we as Pennsylvanians, we as Americans, where we've come from. Right. And things that were important. Why is the landscape here? Why is this named Cornwall? How did the iron industry affect all of this? Why are towns made? Why were communities put here? It was put here because of these industries. Right. But if you wipe the industry off the map, you wipe the workers' houses off the map, and it's so difficult to tell that story.
And places do connect us to those memories where the people are gone. Right. And without those touchstones, that memory does start to fade then.
Right.
So
absolutely.
Yeah, I was telling you about the book that I read, and I've probably mentioned it on the past 4 podcasts, but that really was like a revelation to me, that places, and from a preservation standpoint, that the places are what then connect us to those memories and keep those memories going.
Now, I had a mentor who, he was a stuff person as well, and his thing was artifacts are the key to unwritten history. Yeah. And the idea that oftentimes, possibly a tool with someone's name that was hammered into it, that might be the only thing that exists of that person, but there's a name, so now you might be able to reclaim their history by research. Yeah. So that idea that if the artifacts are gone, there's no touchstone to go ahead and start to look for the history of it.
Yeah. So definitely, I think that those things are important, and we need to. I try to be very practical when when I'm looking at buildings and what should be saved, but I think that probably more should be saved than what we are. Right. Yes. So how can someone help support the site?
Well, the easiest thing to do right now, as far as supporting a site like ours, would be that to go ahead and to tune in to some of the programs that we have online when we reopen. Come to programming that we have. Become a member of a historical organization, even if it's not the Friends of the Cornwall Iron Furnace, which I would kind of like. Of course, there are many county historical societies that can also use that help. There are other museums and other people's local communities that are always looking for not only people that know and love history, but there are so many other aspects to running a place like this. There's always the need for someone to do CPA work. There's always a need for someone to consult with things legally. Someone to be able to organize, someone that would help out to say how to do children's programming. There's so many different ways that people can get involved. I had worked for 13 years at Landis Valley Museum, and we had people that their sole interest was gardening. So coming to take care of gardens and things of that nature. So, getting involved with an organization, joining an organization, and if you have the interest and the financial security to go ahead and make donations to organizations like this as well. We're certainly always looking for people that are interested. We're always certainly looking to further the mission of our museum.
Okay, very good. And then how should someone contact you? Should they visit the website?
Visiting our website would be the easiest, which is cornwallironfurnace.org. They can also call the site, which is 717-272-9711.
Okay, very good. Is there anything that I didn't cover that you wanted to share? Or?
When we were talking a little bit about the idea of preservation, my family, we vacation in Maine, and there's a little town called Wiscasset, which calls itself the prettiest little town in Maine. And going out of Wiscasset, there's a sign that I spotted probably about 15 years ago, and I think it's one of the best things that I've ever seen and so succinctly said, and it says, "Preservation is progress." And that's one of those pieces that I often think about, preserving places like this. That, I believe, is the most progressive thing to do, is to make sure that, historic places are still around. Knocking it down is not progress. Right. Rehabbing it is progress.
Yeah, I agree. I agree very much. Thank you very much for your time today. I enjoyed it.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Practical Preservation Podcast. The resources discussed during this episode are on our website at practicalpreservationservices.com/podcast. If you received value from this episode and know someone else that will get value from it as well, please share it with them. Join us next week for another episode of the Practical Preservation Podcast. For more information on restoring your historic home, visit practicalpreservationservices.com.